Howdy folks, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. And this week I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to talk about. It's not like I sit down to do these videos with a script. I pretty much just ad-lib everything when I do an episode of Mingles with Jingles, but I normally at least have some idea of some of the topics that I'm going to address. This week, I got nothing. I'm sitting here in the man cave. I just had a really nice curry. King prawn madras was very nice. I've had a beer. My belly's full. I'm feeling kind of sleepy. I'm thinking it's getting pretty late on Sunday night. I need to get Mingles with Jingles started. So I fired up Power Director and I selected the first bit of background video, and then I sat down and thought, shit, I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. So, well, tell you what, why don't you all just amuse yourselves for a few minutes while I go and look up what's happened this week. Just give me a minute. Patch 9.1 sitting there. British cruisers and World of Warships? Yeah, maybe. Oh, got it. The KV5. What's going on with the KV5, Jingles? Good question. KV5, as I'm sure almost all of you are probably aware, is a premium Tier 8 heavy Soviet tank in World of Tanks. And having a look through the status report blog, I noticed it immediately grabbed my attention. There was an update on the KV5 situation. I thought, what? I didn't even know there was a KV5 situation. What's going on with the KV5? So I'm reading through it, and the developers are talking about they really don't want to nerf the KV5. I didn't realise the KV5 needed a nerf. What's going on here? And I had to do quite a serious amount of digging. This apparently goes back to February of this year. And I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but it's going to make it look as if I've been living under a rock since February. In patch 9.13, the KV5 got a pretty substantial buff, and I completely didn't realise. If I'd known, I would have probably been playing my KV5 more. For those of you who, well, there are not going to be many of you out there who don't or haven't played World of Tanks, but perhaps you've never played the KV5. It's not available for purchase except for on special occasions. It used to be a tank that was just there in the tech tree in World of Tanks, and you could buy it in-game for gold. Well, that changed a couple of years ago, and now it's one of those premiums that isn't usually on sale in the premium gift shop, but every now and then there's a special occasion they'll put it back on sale. And I quite like my KV5. It's not an overpowered tank by any stretch of the imagination. The armour is good, but it has huge weak spots, and the gun is alright. And so I was kind of mystified that why are people calling for a nerf on the KV5? Well, way back in patch 9.13, and this completely slipped under my radar, the KV5's armour got buffed. And I mean seriously. The thing about the KV5 was it had this, they called it the R2-D2. There's a machine gun turret on the front that looks just like R2-D2. And it's a huge and obvious weak spot on the KV5, right at the front of the tank. If you're driving a KV5 and you manage to cover that weak spot up, well, there's another huge and obvious weak spot right on top of the tank's turret as well, the commander's hatch, which is massive. Not as big as the machine gun turret on the front, but still easy and obvious target to hit. It turns out in patch 9.13, these weak spots got buffed, and I mean seriously buffed. That frontal weak spot, the machine gun turret, its armour went from 130 and 120 millimeters to 150 and 140 millimeters. They didn't touch the commander's hatch on top. That's still 150 millimeters, so you pretty much need to be a tier 8 medium or better shooting at that thing to penetrate. But the other hatch on top went from 170 to 200, and it gets worse. The turret cheeks got buffed to 300 effective from the front. When you look at the sides of the tank as well, this was unbelievable. The side of the turret went from 150 to 185. The turret cheek from the side, effectively 225. And the rear armour, oh wow, Rear of the turret, 180 millimeters. I mean, there are tier 10 heavy tanks in World of Tanks that don't have 180 millimeters of frontal armor. Yeah, the lower glacis, let me just check the figures here, used to be 228, buffed to 240. The mid plate, where the lower glacis becomes the upper glacis, buffed from 224 to 260. And the upper glacis from 240 to 250. These are effective armor thicknesses. So, yeah, turns out that the KV5 got smacked with the buff stick way back in patch 9.13, and I completely hadn't noticed. So, you know, this was quite surprising to me. I did not realise that the KV5 had been buffed quite as strongly as this, and it raised a couple of questions in my head. First and foremost, why? I mean, why did it need to be buffed? I always thought the KV5 was alright. I mean, you know, it had these weaknesses. It was strong in the right circumstances. You had to be good to get the most out of the KV5, but even if you weren't particularly good in the KV5, you were going to do some damage in it, and it's a tier 8 premium, so you're never going to lose money on it, and surely that's the whole point of a premium tank in World of Tanks, particularly the tier 8s, the credit grinders. So why did it need buffing? I've seen people get ridiculous results in that tank. They angle the armour, they cover up the weak spots, they farm damage. Admittedly, when you see somebody doing very, very well in a KV5, he's usually a top tier heavy, but you could argue that about any tank in the game. They always perform best when they're top tier. But the fact remains, with a little bit of skill and imagination, you can do very, very well in the KV5. And even if you don't do very, very well, you're never going to lose money in it. It's a tier 8 premium. And for some bizarre reason, they decided it needed buffing, and not just buffing. I mean, they gave it armor that would make a tier 10 heavy embarrassed. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So my first question, why did they decide to buff the armor of the KV5 of all things? My second question, obviously this has upset some people. Why did it take 7 months? Why did it take 7 months for the devs to respond in a Q&A about the possible nerfs to the KV5? And my third question, because the devs' answer is they don't know what to do about the KV5, is what do you mean you don't know what to do? Just put it back to the way it was. You see, Wargaming have issues when it comes to changing the stats on premium tanks. Right, this has always been, how can I put this? Anytime they've introduced a premium into the game, Type 59 is a perfect example. Anytime they introduce a premium into the game that overperforms, they don't want to mess around with the stats of the tank, because people have paid money for the premium tank. And people will be perfectly entitled to say, well, hang on a minute, this isn't what I paid for anymore. I want my money back. And they don't want to deal with that kind of headache. So when they have a premium tank that overperforms, like the E25, like the Type 59, rather than messing around with the stats of the tank, their preferred approach is to just remove it from sale. If you've got one, well, good for you. They're not going to mess around with it. They've done this with the majority, if not all, of the premium tanks that have preferential matchmaking. Another example of how they don't like to mess around with premium vehicles, even when everything around them is changing, is the FCM Pack 40, the premium French Tier 3 tank destroyer. They nerfed the view range of all the tank destroyers across the board in the game, except for the premiums, including the FCM Pack 40. It's a Tier 3 tank destroyer with a 400-metre view range. It's the seal-clubbing, low-tier tank destroyer of choice. And it was pretty good before they nerfed the view range. I mean, 400-metre view range at Tier 3 is ridiculous. Even more so, now they've nerfed the view range of all the other tank destroyers. I mean, it stands out even further now. So they're certainly not shy about leaving ridiculously overperforming premiums in the game. Just look at the Panzer IIJ, for example. Oh, Panzer IIJ, another perfect example. That little monster. A Tier 3 light tank that's got better armour than a Tier 5 heavy, and it has preferential matchmaking. It's practically unkillable at Tier 3. And a couple of patches back, they buffed the armour on that as well. If there was one tank in the game that needed a nerf, more than any other, it was the Panzer IIJ. But that thing changes hands for hundreds of euros. And they went and buffed the weak spots. The FCM Pack 40, 400 meters view range at tier 3. Can you imagine that thing on the Mittengard map? You would never need to leave the spawn to be able to hit the enemy tanks in their spawn. So, yeah. But anyway, back to the KV-5. I genuinely have no idea what possessed them to buff that thing in the first place. It just didn't need it. I mean, were they just bored one day? They didn't have enough to do, and they're all sitting around going, "Yeah, I'm bored, stuck in a rut, and I want out. What can I do today?" I know, we'll buff the armour of the KV-5. Why do you want to buff the armour of the KV-5? Why not? You know? We did it with a Panzer IIJ. Nobody will notice. So, yeah. So, they've basically backed themselves into a corner now because they don't like messing around with the stats of premiums. You can see where I'm going with this, don't you? As they've said in this latest Q&A, they do not know what to do with a KV-5 because they really, really don't like messing around with the stats of premium vehicles because people have paid money for them. Hang on a minute. You just did mess around with the stats of the premium vehicle. You buffed the armour. That's why we're in this position in the first place. So you clearly don't mind messing around with the stats of premium vehicles, you know, when you're bored and you've got nothing better to do. So just, is it just me? I mean, the solution seems really simple. Just change it back to the way it was. You're not nerfing it, you're unbuffing it. But this solution doesn't appear to have occurred to anybody. Does everybody else see the logic in my argument? I mean, it's not just me, is it? Oh, but Jingles, what about all those people who have bought KV-5s since the armour got buffed? They're not going to be happy. They're going to demand their money back. Well, yeah, but how many have they sold in the last 7 months? Don't forget, the KV-5 is not available for normal purchase in the premium gift shop. You cannot buy it in the tech tree for gold. It only goes on sale on special occasions. How many special occasions have they had in the last 7 months? Alright, they've probably sold some, but just give people the option of refunds. I mean, it's not going to break the bank. I really don't see why this is such a hard problem. But Jingles, you see, the problem is that if they roll back the armour buff, then they're back in the original situation they were in February, wondering how they can buff the KV-5. It doesn't need to be buffed! I feel like I'm talking to a brick wall here. You know, this is one of those problems that just doesn't need to be a problem. It should never have been a problem. They just needed to leave things alone, and I don't know. I give up. Nothing wrong with the KV-5, or at least there was nothing wrong with it until they started messing around. So, you know, they've kind of made this problem for themselves. Still, I shouldn't complain. You know, it gives me something to talk about in Mingles with Jingles in a quiet week, so... Nice one, Wargaming. Thanks. Anyway, in other news, meanwhile, on Planet Rita, I'm sorry, this is good. Rita's done it again. Rita said something really stupid this weekend. And you know what? She hasn't actually said or done anything particularly dense in a couple of weeks. I mean, there was the whole issue with the spirit level in the garden thing in Mingles with Jingles a couple of weeks back, but I easily beat her that week by neglecting to realise that I'd had a heater on behind my cupboard in the man cave for the last 10 years and was wondering why it was so hot in the summer. So, yeah, she kind of got a pass on that one. But this weekend, yep, she's back on form. She's surpassed herself yet again. This weekend, we had some friends down from Birmingham, so we went out for a meal. The food was great. The conversation was hilarious. Sorry, I know what's coming. Anyway, yes. So the conversation got around to the holiday in Turkey that our friends had just come back from. Now, our friend Roy is very, very tall. I'm not sure of his exact height, but he's around about 6'5", 6'6". He's very tall, he's very skinny. He has a white beard and he wears glasses. He doesn't have a lot of hair up top, which is kind of surprising because... well, aside from the glasses, the not a lot of hair up top and the white beard, he looks nothing like me. All right, I mean, I've got a fair amount of lower glacis armour going on here, and I'm not particularly tall. I'm 5'11". I'm 1 inch shy of 6 feet, and yet Roy is constantly getting mistaken for me whenever he goes to Tank Fest. People keep coming up to him and asking him if he's the mighty Jingles. It's probably got something to do with the fact that he escorts Rita around when I'm busy doing a meet and greet. So, people see Rita, they think, oh, I recognise her. That must be Jingles. No, it's not. That's Roy. Well, anyway. Now, all of the women in Roy's family, with one exception, are very, very tall as well. Most of them aren't far short of 6 feet tall, which is very tall for a woman. The one exception, of course, is Roy's missus. She's a bit of a midget. I think she's about 5 feet 4, which is not particularly short for a woman, but, when you're standing next to people that are 6 feet or higher, you feel pretty small. Rita, of course, well, she's a bit of a hobbit herself. You stick some hair on her feet and you could easily mistake her for Frodo Baggins. So Rita was feeling a little bit, guilty by association here, as we're all laughing at the idea of poor old Sharon, Roy's missus, who's all of 5 feet tall, standing next to all these giants while they're on holiday in Turkey. So Rita decided for some reason that she had to leap to her defence by claiming that 5 foot 4 wasn't particularly short. Sensing weakness, we all demanded to know, why, Rita, how tall are you? To which she replied, and I'm not making this up, I'm 5 foot 25. I might need to stop and explain this to anybody who's not American or British. People who use the metric system. 5 feet and 25 inches is 7 feet and 1 inch tall. Right, Rita was claiming to be the tallest woman in the world. She didn't realise. I think she was getting her feet and centimetres mixed up and was claiming to be 5 feet and 25 centimetres tall. I'm not entirely sure, but that's the best explanation I could come up with. And even if that is the case, why would you describe your height in metric and imperial? It just doesn't make sense. So we're all having a good laugh at her expense, and she doesn't understand why. She doesn't realise what she's said. When we finish laughing, we explain it to her, and then she makes it worse. Oh no, she said, struggling to come up with a way of explaining what she said and make it sound less stupid. And failing spectacularly, because the very next thing she said, and my apologies in advance to the people of Wales for what you're about to hear, but these are her words, not mine. No, she said, you don't understand. I was using Welsh measurements. What are Welsh measurements, Rita? Oh, how they measure things in Wales. What are you talking about, Rita? Why would the Welsh measure things differently to anybody else? Oh, it's because of the sheep. I'll tell you, if ever you're at one of those boring cocktail parties where nobody has anything interesting to say, just invite Rita along, give her a couple of cocktails, sit back and enjoy the show, because she never fails to deliver. Anyway, next up, how about some actual news? British cruisers, World of Warships. Now, they are on the way, but they're probably going to take longer to arrive than you might be expecting. And the reason for this, and I have to be very careful what I say here because I can't actually discuss the stats of any of the ships or my detailed impressions of the ships so far, particularly because anything that I had to say about the British cruisers based on my playing of the British cruisers would be completely irrelevant because Wargaming have pulled them all. You may have noticed that you haven't been seeing British cruisers popping up in your random battles at random intervals anymore. It's because they've all basically been pulled and Wargaming are completely redoing them. And the reason they've done this is because they weren't really happy with the flavour of the British cruisers. What are you talking about, Jingles? What do you mean flavour? You don't eat ships, what are you on about? Well, look at the Japanese destroyers, for example. Everybody knows what to expect when they see a Japanese destroyer on the enemy team. Long-range, sneaky torpedo sniper. American destroyers, they're going to pepper you with high-firing arc gunfire from long range. They're going to be fast, they're going to be manoeuvrable, and so on and so on. And the flavour of the British cruisers was that you basically sit in a smokescreen and spam high explosive. And it was effective, but it wasn't particularly interesting. And Wargaming seemed to agree, and they want to rework the way British cruisers work. Make them more interesting, more challenging, more engaging to play, and I do think it was the right decision. Now, I only got to play as far as the tier 7 before they pulled them from the test, and the premium tier 7, I think it was, the Belfast. And they weren't bad. Again, I've got to be real careful what I say here. I shouldn't really be giving opinions. Tell you what, the opinion that you can take away from this is that pulling the British cruisers and reworking the way they play is definitely the right decision. Now, this does, of course, mean that you're probably not going to see the British cruisers appearing as soon as you may have expected them to appear. Obviously, they're taking them away, they're reworking the way they play. You are going to see the same cruisers, however, this much I can at least confirm. You're still going to get the Black Swan at Tier 1, leading all the way up via the Emerald, I think it was, at Tier 5, the Leander at Tier 6, the Minotaur at Tier 10, the Neptune at Tier 9. You know, they're still going to be the same ships, they're just going to play differently, and hopefully more interestingly than they were when I had my hands on them, because I didn't really like them. And I'm probably in trouble with Wargaming for saying that much. But, well, they're changing the way they work. So any opinions that I may have had on the way the British cruisers worked are now completely irrelevant, because they're taking them away for exactly that reason, to make them more interesting to play. And I do think it's the right thing to do. I must hasten to add, by the way, because I know all kinds of people are going to be jumping to the wrong conclusions here. I'm not saying the British cruisers were bad. I'm not saying Wargaming did a bad job of implementing the British cruisers. They weren't bad. You could do very, very well in the British cruisers. They just weren't very interesting. And that is what Wargaming are concerned about, the fact that they were kind of boring to play. And that's why they've taken them away to remodel them. Anyway, I really have struggled to come up with things to talk about this week. I mean, I don't normally have that problem, do I? Normally getting me to shut up is... That's normally the problem in Mingles with Jingles. So, you know what? I'm going to throw the gauntlet down in this week's episode. Because that's the way Mingles with Jingles used to work, wasn't it? You lot would ask questions and I would answer them. And I have been reading the comments, but nobody's really asking much in the way of questions anymore. Instead, what seems to happen is I do an episode of Mingles with Jingles and everybody just talks about what it was that I talked about in that episode of Mingles with Jingles. So... that's what I want to do next week. Let's see the questions return in the comments, and I'll have a good look through them and I'll pick the best ones, and we'll make it a sort of a question and answer session in next week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. And, you know, if I've got anything funny to talk about, I'll do that as well. But let's try to get back to basics with the way this whole video log thing is going. So, that's the challenge for this week. Let's see some questions in the comments, not related necessarily to what I've talked about in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Although if I've talked about anything in this week's Mingles with Jingles that you want me to expand upon, then, you know, that's a fair question as well. So that's the challenge for this week. And that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.